Clientelism, patronage, and nepotism. Three words that are usually synonymous with corruption. But what do they truly mean? So, in simplistic terms, clientelism, patronage, and nepotism, and I'm grouping them together because they are easier to define, it's a social structure where individuals exchange favor for resources, either for direct gain, for favors, or kinship selection. Clientelism, which is the head of the two, is rooted within human behavior in reciprocal altruism as well as kinship selection. The main concept behind it is that one individual is surrounded by other individuals of its own kind, as well as other partnerships he or she has managed to develop throughout their lives, which they will prefer to benefit those people over someone else. In countries where democratic values or democratic principles are not as strong, clientelistic societies become way more prevalent. This is both supported by the history of each different country, so the degree of clientelism that exists within that country, as well as the pre existing culture of that country. To understand it better, imagine and diagram where one individual, in this case you, where you have your own close connections, your family, and your very close friends. This constitutes your primary layer of connections. Then you have an outer layer of other connections you have, your second cousins, as well as your other friends, which are close but not as close, and you wouldn't classify them as your best friends. Then you have an even bigger outer layer, including all the other people you know that you have worked with before, that you have helped them in the past, and all of these people are the so called your network. This network overreaches even more away from your own connections. So even if you, as an individual, know person A very well, person A knows person B, where in his way that person B can help you even if you do not know him directly. That's clientelism in its simplest form. As you can observe in the diagram, each individual has its own circle of connections, and there are various layers of these connections. How strong they become is determined by birth, as well as biology, as well as pre existing factors and the way you grew up. On top of it, there are people which they do not have very strong connections with a lot of people, either due to lack of family or due to lack of socialization, or generally because they have been outskirts of society. And these people circles are very small. Now, in a clientelistic societies, generally circles determine a lot how a country functions. Because in a clientelistic society, the rule of law is generally very weak because the priority of each individual is to serve himself, his own interior circle, as well as hers outer circles, and etc. 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 Each individual serving each according to his own circle and network's benefit. This type of system inevitably leads to patronage and nepotism, which refers to the power of a person to confer or bestow advantages, often in return for support or loyalty. In politics in general, patronage is often used to reward supporters, friends, relatives, and so forth. Nepotism, on the other hand, is a form of a favoritism which is granted to relatives in various outer circles that you create throughout your life. And imagine both patronage and nepotism are two quite strong evils when it comes to a society that strives to live on democratic values and rule of law. That is why clientelistic and strong clientelistic societies tend to have very low levels of personal responsibility and democratic accountability. Let's see now why clientelistic societies, governments, tend not to function very well. Each individual that acquires power through the government and has a strong position within that government, he or she will prioritize to serve his interior, outer, and even outer circles as to be able to maintain that position, as well as benefit his or her own circles. This goes on and on in government, and the government just becomes a vehicle as for individuals to be able to abuse it for their own circles. This is the main reason that we see extremely high levels of corruption in very clientelistic societies. While many people in those societies will argue that and will shout in speeches about the good of the people and so forth, and what they truly care about is serving their own. The question that comes in mind, though, is whether this is inevitable or it can be fixed, and whether clientelism as a structure of society is something that is inherently bad. Severe clientelism, or in cases where one circle is so overreaching and so strong that it practically dominates every single other circle, this will always lead to a system that is so corrupted that it's practically unable to function. In these forms of government, especially in sub-Saharan African countries, the government practically does not exist in any meaningful form outside of serving that individual and its circle. While in countries, for example, in Southern Europe, where clientelism is prevalent, is not so strong, and thus everyone practically gets served except a minority of people that have zero connections and they are the so-called outskirts of society. It does not imply, though, that those governments are actually functioning practically. I will argue that clientelism cannot inherently be fixed, or at least in the short term, and that inherently is not as bad as it seems. When it comes to government, though, clientelism is always bad. This implies that if you have a very strong government in monetary terms, that government can then be abused by everyone, and thus it's bound to fail. If the government is generally weak, or the government doesn't have a strong authority to abuse or to generate enough revenue, and even if the system is corruptible, but it has some sort of rule of law, then it can still function theoretically in some practical manner. This implies that in clientelistic societies, the stronger the government is, inevitably the more corrupt the society will be. As we have observed in history, attempts to change societies have massively failed. And this leads to either individuals gaining too much power in their hands or generally mass slaughter. An example of these societal interventions can be observed in the Soviet Union, Maoist China, Cambodia, Vietnam, etc., and in a lesser extent, Latin America, Southern Europe, the Arab world, India, and so forth. The way that clientelistic societies can improve their governments, in my opinion, is simply by reducing the strength and the authority of the state when it comes to monetary means, but not necessarily when it comes to rule of law. This implies that those in power cannot directly benefit monetarily using the government, and thus their own circles cannot completely depend on the success of the manipulation of the government for them to succeed. Furthermore, clientelism is in itself, as a crucial thing, is not as inherently bad. Clientelistic societies tend to have strong benefits over more corporate societies. mainly because these circles that we have mentioned prior act as a web of protection in bad times. Humans have developed clientelism as a natural form for survival, as in a tribalistic instinct. So the idea is that if you have a sick person in the family or an individual that has fallen on hard times, then the circle will in many cases come together to protect and help that individual. So in more successful clientelistic societies, we observe generally higher levels of middle class individuals and very lower levels of people in extreme poverty, despite the general lack of wealth in the system, meaning in comparison to the society, people are classified as middle class, despite the general corruption of the system. For example, Cyprus, my own island, has, for a time at least, a very strong middle class, a very small but a very rich class, and a poor class, but a very few number of people in extreme poverty, despite the fact that in generally is not the wealthiest country. So even after the 2012 euro crisis, thousands of people lost their homes as well as their savings, but we had almost no individual that was practically left in the street. This was not due to how effective the government was, but mainly because of the clientelistic nature of our society. The same applies to other countries such as Greece, Italy, Spain, Portugal, and so forth. Clientelism is also beneficial when it comes to innovation. When one individual develops a new idea, people will tend to go and buy from the shop of their own relative compared to his competitor, even if his competitor is giving a product at a lower price, mainly because that person is within his own circle. And thus, one, by serving the other, allows each individual at some extent to thrive or at least to survive. The issue that arises within clientelistic societies are individuals with very small circles. That implies the outskirts of society. These individuals tend to get the complete negative effects of clientelism, since not only do they not possess the network to support them on good times, but they can never get the advantage or fair treatment from the government, since the government is used by the circle of other people which are much stronger than their own. These people, unfortunately, even if they are the cleverest ones, tend to emigrate abroad to more corporate societies, since this type of clientelistic societies do not serve them. In conclusion, clientelism as a structure of society is inherently built in humans. Nonetheless, the extent of clientelism differs between people's cultures and histories. You cannot change human behavior completely and immediately. But as we can observe through history, good democratic principles and rule of law, societies can adapt to various degrees and at least lessen the negative effects of clientelism. On the other hand, though, by doing so, a society also loses the benefits of clientelism, meaning that the web of support for various individuals, for people that do not live in a clientelistic society, they cannot truly apprehend how beneficial those circles truly are. At the same time, people living in clientelistic societies tend to always complain about their clientelistic societies, not appreciating the cultural benefits of their clientelistic societies. So I will close with the remark that if you live in a clientelistic society, then you should strive for a minimalistic government as to limit the negative effects of the clientelistic society, but not the destruction of that clientelistic society per se. Thank you for watching. Please like and subscribe, and see you next time.